My name is Julia Clark, and I'm J.A. Wilson Professor of Paleontology at the University of Texas at Austin.
Okay, Julia, would you start out by telling us how you became interested in vertebrate paleontology?
It was really a circuitous path. My early childhood, I did enjoy digging things up. And just to start that another way, I'd say you could trace my origin stories in various different ways. I was always interested in exploration, so since I was a little kid, and I was fascinated by museum collections, particularly because they seemed to blend human narratives of discovery with scientific objects. And so I did a project on that in high school, but I didn't know vertebrate paleontology would be my thing. So it wasn't until I was an undergraduate, I took a class on the KPG boundary my senior year. It was a graduate class that some undergrads could take. And I was fascinated by the kinds of questions and how difficult it was to answer some questions of why do biotic crises occur and why would there be dinosaur survivorship and dinosaur extinction. So across this major mass extinction event. So that was when I started thinking maybe this is something I want to look into.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your current research interests and maybe a couple of significant contributions that you've made to the field.
Yeah, sure. My current research is on the origin and evolution of birds. But writ broadly, I'm interested in biological novelty. I'm interested in how in evolution, simultaneously, everything is old. But there are some innovations that are kind of out of norm. They stand out against the background tick of innovation that we see, and how do those arise? And how do they influence future biodiversity? So in particular, I discovered the oldest known fossilized remains of the bird vocal organ in the late Cretaceous, so from the age of dinosaurs. But I realized we didn't have any fundamental data to make sense of that structure. We didn't know how it arose in ontogeny in living birds. We didn't know how it related to acoustic function and communication directly in terms of the structure. So it was a whole new playground for ideas, for collaborations, in terms of looking at this novelty and what it teaches us about biological novelty more generally.
So maybe you could just share a little bit of what you learned about specifically the acoustic or ancestral acoustic communication, perhaps.
I guess what we learned was that in some ways it's a story of how little we as yet know. We know that crocodilians and us use a larynx-based sound source in all of this amazing complex communication we have, and to a lesser degree in crocodilians. But why is that lost in dinosaurs, and why does a whole new vocal organ arise in a place that it's never seen in any other tetrapod? So deep in the chest, right next to the heart. And we're still working on that problem. So my talking to you today is really like in the middle of that process. But what we do think we've learned about novelty is that sensory-linked novelties like different pigmentation types, different sound makers, may more commonly arise kind of iteratively, like in an additive way, rather than in natural selected things like locomotion, where a locomotor mode transitions from one to a new locomotor mode, and the old locomotor mode, parts of it are lost, or parts. So that's some of the things that we're finding. We just published this year.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, we're going to switch tacks a little bit here, and I want to know a little. I mean, you obviously are a mentor for students now, but you must have had some important mentors in the course of your career. Maybe you could share with us a few of them.
Well, I think just to be a troublemaker, I think the concept of mentorship is a concept that's simultaneously really broad, right? It's and we've been having discussions around that in my group. And we kind of honed in on two things. They're people who help you get to the next stage in your career, and they're people you can trust. And so, you know, some people, including me, would identify family members as early mentors. But then there are also people who help you in career stages, like in different periods, and definitely I've been privileged to have some really good ones throughout my career, like at the undergraduate level, the graduate level. But I would hesitate to name any particular individual as life-changing. In my case, it really was, it was supported by a village. It takes a village. Right. Like there are a lot of people who supported me at key moments in my career.
Okay, and then kind of spinning off of this, if you had somebody that wanted to go into vertebrate paleontology, what kind of advice would you give them?
I would say that someone who's looking at vertebrate paleontology maybe is intrigued as I was by these physical objects, by the idea of discovering something that's never been seen before and thinking about that. But I really firmly believe that science is a hugely creative enterprise in the best meaning, which is that to ask new questions, you have to not just think about these parts of our deep past, but you have to think about how they relate to a network of living organisms and learning more about living organism ecology, life history, function, and these can never be separate in vertebrate paleontology. But in terms of career advice, what would be my advice? I guess I'd give my advice, career advice, very broadly. And I'd say hold on to things that you're most passionate about, and for me that was really a kind of curiosity and exploration that is in all different parts of my career, in the lab and in the field. But it could lead you in directions that you'd never anticipated. I, for one, never knew as a child I wanted to be a vertebrate paleontologist. I wanted to go see the world, and I loved biological discovery, I loved archaeological discovery, and I thought, I can't just stay in my own backyard. That this science truly needs to be international, that we need to look at all parts of the globe, and that's what I loved about science. So you need to follow, maybe you start out wanting to be a vertebrate paleontologist and you go in a different direction, leads you to another aspect of set of questions. So I guess I don't want people to be tied in by a notion of what vertebrate paleontology is. It's so connected with all of these other questions and ways of looking at the world that I don't like to see it apart.
Yeah, more so now than maybe when I was first starting out, because of course vertebrate paleontology came out of a geology background.
Absolutely.
And now it's just, you just go and you hear these talks, and yeah, it's very integrated. Developmental biology, including, and many other things, isotope, geochemistry, just lots of different areas, I guess the next question is just if you could maybe share some challenges that you've faced and maybe lessons that you've learned by confronting them.
I mean, I think some of the greatest challenges that I've had in science, I've overcome by having a network of peer supporters. So whether you want to call them mentors, I'd really call them great colleagues that have offered advice, that have offered support, that can talk about their experiences dealing with a particular professional situation. And people who've been around longer, who've maybe dealt with a lot of the same things that I've dealt with. And unfortunately, when we look at vertebrate paleontology, there actually aren't that many women in front of me. There are a ton that are coming up and doing all this exciting stuff. But my peer colleagues or supporters in these more challenging times I've had have often been women faculty that are not in my area. They have dealt with some of the challenges of an academic context or a scientific context, but maybe in different disciplines. And we've supported each other through challenging times.
Yeah, because you do so much field work, I wondered if you had any specific challenges related to your experience as a field paleontologist.
Oh yeah. So I guess, I do think field paleontology is something that almost with this integrative context for vertebrate paleontology we're in danger of losing, because a lot of people work on fossils other people collected. And I'm wholly committed to the idea that we need to still discover new fossils to drive new questions. And, you know, being a field paleontologist as a woman, you know, what are particular challenges? I mean, part of me, if I'm frank, would be hesitant to speak on film about this. You know, I mean, I think that like I'd be more likely to speak about it.
I understand.
And my professional barriers if I was not being filmed.
Yeah.
So that kind of changes that conversation. But, you know, I think negotiating different starting places, there might be contexts where everybody else doing this thing, this field work, you're the only woman. I mean, I remember when I was just out of grad school and it was me and literally like 15 Chinese guys, you know, and so we had cultural differences. Not necessarily, you know, different communities and cultures are more supportive of women scientists or respect education. So as someone who was a highly educated woman, I was kind of like a weird, you know, outlier, right, maybe. But I don't know what to say there. Yeah, I think it is challenging in the context of fieldwork to often be other.
Right.
Maybe that's how I'd sum it up, is like that you're still an outlier. You're still the one of two on a field team, or I was. Or as leading my own field expedition, sometimes I've encountered things where I feel like I'm doing, maybe someone turns to someone who's a male member of my team, assuming that they have authority in place of the actual field leader who raised all the money and does all the planning, and you know. But I've also been fortunate in many cases with my collaborators, obviously the ones that I continue to work with, that we've worked out those differences. And I have done international fieldwork since I was a grad student. So it's not a barrier I don't see it as a barrier, I see it as something you have to commit because you're so passionate about doing this thing that you will move beyond things that might arise. And, but it can be a very tricky context for women. I've seen a lot of pitfalls for people with budding field programs in that regard, you know. Yeah. And I realize I'm being rather vague.
Well, but I think it's important. I think what you're saying is you negotiate up front before some of these things might even come to the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, I think for field planning, there are often miscommunications, and whether they're due to language barriers or cultural barriers, or whether they're just due to two individuals trying to communicate with each other, it's important to work those things out. And it's not always like really easy to do. Right. Definitely doing it in person is far better than attempting it via some other way of communicating. It is important to lay out expectations at the beginning, but it's often uncomfortable to do so because in some contexts, direct communication about those kinds of things is not expected culturally, shall we say, you know? Okay. But, yeah.
I guess the last question is really just, is there anything else you want to add that we haven't really touched on that relates to your vertebrate paleontology experiences that you want to share?
There are many times that I thought I would leave academic science and vertebrate paleontology in particular. And
really?
Yeah, it occurred to me to do so in grad school. It occurred to me to do so where I actually looked at other career pathways when I was a postdoc.
So what kept you going?
Well, I think, what happened was something would come through. So for example, I was interested in the history of science, and I wanted to do a Marshall Fellowship looking at the history of natural history, but then I got invited to go to Patagonia for the first time, and I was like, wow, I really want to do that. And in each one of those junctures, I looked at what I really value and why I'm a scientist. And sometimes there's a bunch of clutter and a bunch of junk going on in the background, but if you can hone in and you can focus on why you wanted to do this thing and really just make sure you're doing a lot of that as opposed to this other stuff, then you can keep going. And I think I was fortunate that, right at moments where I was like, maybe I'll take another path, I got a tenure track job, but I still think about it. And the thing that if I focus on the questions I'm asking and the group of people I like to work with and what we're doing, then I'm happy. I'm a happy little paleo clam. But if I get too marred down in the politics or the context in which the science is happening, then that can really lead you to choose a path that maybe seems easier. I don't know if it actually is, because I've never chosen another path. I clearly am still a scientist. Yeah. And I'm now a full professor. I didn't experience any big change in my level of security or feelings about staying in science when I became tenured. But I do feel that becoming a full professor, and that did change. Something did change for me in feelings of freedom about what I wanted to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand.